On July 10th, a filing landed in a federal court in Tennessee. Buried a few pages in, the woman who built one of the fastest growing whiskey brands in America, locked out of her company's computers, stripped of any role at the business that bears her personal stamp on every bottle. No trial, no criminal conviction, just a receiver's signature. This is the story of Fawn Weaver, Uncle Nearest, and how a founder can lose control of the exact thing she built while still insisting, loudly and often, that she did nothing wrong. Fawn Weaver was not a whiskey person. Born Fawn Wilson in Pasadena in '76, her father was a Motown songwriter and producer, the kind of career that put her as a kid in rooms with people like Stevie Wonder, Smokey Robinson, before he changed course entirely and became a Christian minister. That instability followed her into her teenage years. At 15, she left home. She stayed for a while with some school friends in the Jordan Downs and the housing projects in Watts. Watts up, that's home for me. Then she cycled through 3 homeless shelters, the last one being Covenant House in Hollywood. None of that reads like the origin story of a whiskey mogul. And for most of her adult life, it wasn't. In her 20s, she built an events and public relations company. She spent the 2000s working in restaurants and real estate. In March of 2010, she founded her own holding company, Grant Signey, Inc. And in 2014, she became a published author. A marriage advice book called Happy Wives Club that hit number 3 on the New York Times nonfiction paperback list, followed by a second book on conflict-free marriage in 2015. By 2018, Time magazine had named her one of 31 people changing the American South. In March of 2021, she was named to the board of directors of Endeavor, the entertainment and talent agency behind UFC and William Morris. A serious mainstream credential for someone with, at that point, no formal background in either finance or spirit. By 2016, Fawn Weaver was a business consultant, board member, and a relationship author with zero connection to the spirits industry. She was 40 years old, and she was about to stumble into a story that would turn her into the people CEO. Her own words, not the industry's. In 2016, Weaver traveled to Tennessee to interview the descendants of a man named Nathan Nearest Green for a book, not a business. What she found out became the whole business. Nearest Green was an enslaved man who taught a teenage Jack Daniel how to distill whiskey. He was Jack Daniel's first master distiller, the man who actually built the process the world's best known whiskey brand is built on. And for more than a century, his name has been left out of the official story entirely. Weaver met his descendants, including a woman named Victoria Edie Butler. And the deeper she dug, the more the book project turned into something bigger than the book. Weaver didn't just finish it. She poured her own savings into the book, took on debt most people would call reckless, and in 2017 founded Nearest Green Distillery and launched Uncle Nearest Premium Whiskey, becoming the first African-American woman to lead a major spirits brand with the industry's first all-female executive team. Victoria E. Butler, Nearest Green's great-great-granddaughter, eventually became the brand's master blender. And then it moved fast. By 2018, the brand was already in 12 countries. In September of 2019, Uncle Nearest opened its own distillery, a 270-acre property in Shelbyville, Tennessee. And that same year, Weaver became the first African-American ever on the cover of American Whiskey magazine. Uncle Nearest became the best-selling black-owned spirit brand in history, and it kept collecting hardware. Across the years that followed, it would be named the most awarded bourbon and American whiskey brand in the industry, 7 years running. In 2021, with the brand firmly established, Weaver launched a $50 million venture fund to invest in other minority-owned spirit companies, backed in part by outside investors, including a vehicle connected to hip-hop mogul and entrepreneur Jay-Z. Keep that detail in the back of your mind. It's going to matter a lot later. By the middle of this decade, Uncle Nearest was being called the fastest growing whiskey brand in the country, with a reported valuation around $1.1 billion. It broke into Nielsen's top 20 super premium whiskey brands in just 5 years, a category dominated by companies that have existed for a century or more. Its distillery now pulls in more than 200,000 visitors annually, making it one of the most visited distilleries anywhere in the world. Weaver had built something enormous, and she'd built it as the very public face of it. She called herself the People CEO. She was on magazine covers, in Ford portrait features, on stage at conferences, telling the Nearest Green story to anyone who would listen. The story wasn't just marketing. It was, by every account, true, important, and overdue. Nearest Green really had been erased from the record for 100 years, and Fawn Weaver really put him back into it. By every visible measure, revenue, awards, cultural impact, this was one of the greatest modern founder stories. But underneath all of it, something else was happening. In July of 2025, Uncle Nearest lender Farm Credit Mid-America filed a federal lawsuit, not against a competitor, not an employee, but against the company itself, its distillery, its real estate arm, and Fawn and Keith Weaver personally. The number attached to it, over $108 million. The allegations? Defaults on multiple loans, misuse of loan proceeds, inflated collateral reporting, and failure to maintain the financial covenants the loan required. Farm Credit said the company had actually been in default since as early as January 2024, a year and a half before any of this became public knowledge. The lawsuit also pointed at Uncle Nearest's former chief financial officer, Michael Senzaki, alleging fraud in how the company's finances were reported to the lender in the first place. Farm Credit asked the court for something drastic: a receiver, a court-appointed outsider who would step in and take over the company's financial and operating decisions, effectively stripping the founders of day-to-day control while underlying case played out in court. In August of 2025, the court granted it. Philip G. Young Jr., a court-appointed receiver with a background untangling distressed businesses, was appointed receiver of Uncle Nearest, and from that point forward, he, not Fawn Weaver, controlled the company's money and its major decisions. Weaver did not go quietly. She rallied public support under a banner declaring the company unshaken, pushing back publicly on the idea that anything was fundamentally wrong. At a business conference not long after, in front of a room of entrepreneurs, she called the receivership a smear campaign tactic, and told the crowd that the only real difference between history's most successful founders and the ones who eventually failed was whether they gave up during a hard stretch in the middle. It's a genuinely great line for a keynote stage. It's a much harder position to hold once a federal court has already taken the keys away. And once the fight to get those keys back is the very thing that ends up breaking the company. Here's where Fawn Weaver's story stops looking like an ordinary leadership dispute and starts to look like something else entirely. Rather than accept the receivership and fight it through the same court that appointed it, Weaver tried to route around the process altogether. She filed a Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on behalf of the company, while the company was legally under someone else's control. A federal judge ruled the filing unauthorized and in direct violation of a prior court order. The bankruptcy was struck down entirely. The receiver then sought financial sanctions against her, $25,000 for each unauthorized filing. 3 filings, $75,000 total. Instead of stepping back after that loss, Weaver went public in a much bigger way. She put out a press release through her personal holding company, Grant Sidney, declaring the receivership over. She posted a 6-minute video to social media claiming she had resumed control of the business. She sent text messages to every single Uncle Nearest employee, including one announcing she was appealing the ruling. None of it was true. The receivership hadn't ended, and it wouldn't for a long time, but the confusion it caused was very real. Employees, vendors, distributors, and creditors all separately contacted the receiver, trying to figure out who was actually in charge of the company they work with. At least one prospective buyer paused a deal already in progress. At least one senior employee resigned, citing the sheer whiplash of the situation. Distributor payments were delayed while everyone waited for clarity that didn't come. The receiver went back to court and asked for a gag order to legally stop Weaver, her husband, and their holding company from discussing the case publicly at all with anyone connected to the business. Then in May of 2026, the case turned into something more serious than a loan dispute. The court expanded the receivership to include Weaver's own personal holding company, after a judge found that a $20 million loan from an investment vehicle connected to Jay-Z had been routed through that holding company and represented to Farm Credit as if it were Weaver's own personal money. The judge said that specific act met the legal standard for fraudulent conduct. On June 1st, 2026, the receiver terminated Fawn and Keith Weaver's employment and involvement with Uncle Nearest entirely. Their access to company systems was cut off. Their personal property was returned to them. In his quarterly report to the court, filed on July 10th, Young said the decision was not made lightly, but it had resulted in significantly less confusion among employees and vendors and made day-to-day operations run considerably smoother. The company remains insolvent. A forensic investigation is still underway, one that could eventually produce further legal claims against the Weavers, the former CFO, or entities they control. And the receiver expects to file notice of a sale of Uncle Nearest's core assets within the next 30 to 60 days, a sale that could happen directly through the receivership court or through a separate prepackaged bankruptcy filing, this time properly authorized. The Weavers still dispute the core allegations. In their own court filings, they argue that the reduction in the company's borrowing base from farm credit reclassifying the company's whiskey inventory, not from any false reporting on Uncle Nearest's part. No criminal charges have been filed against either of them, so the story is not finished. So what's the actual lesson here? Beyond don't commit fraud, which fairly nobody needs a 15-minute video to learn. The specific mechanism matters more than the headline. It wasn't the whiskey business itself that triggered the fraud finding. Uncle Nearest, by every account, is a genuinely excellent product with a genuinely important story behind it. What triggered it was an outside investor's loan getting routed through a personal holding company and then presented to a lender as if it were personal funds. That's not a business failing on its own merits. That's the line between the company's money and my money getting blurry under pressure. Exactly the kind of blur that turns an ordinary cash flow problem into a legal one. The second lesson is about what a founder does once they've actually lost control. Weaver didn't just contest the underlying allegations through the court, which would have been an ordinary path. She fought the court's process itself, filing an unauthorized bankruptcy and telling employees the receivership was over before it legally was. That's specifically what turned a lender dispute into financial sanctions, a gag order fight, and ultimately a June 1st lockout from the very company she founded. There's an uncomfortable truth in here for any founder who becomes the public face of their own brand. There's an uncomfortable truth in here for any founder who becomes the public face of their own brand. That visibility is a real asset. Right up until the moment your personal credibility is the thing a lender, a judge, or a court-appointed receiver has to weigh against your actual paperwork. Fawn Weaver may still win pieces of this fight in court, but right now, she's fighting it from outside the building she built for a brand whose real story, Nearest Green's story, was actually never in question. If you want to see how this one ends, the asset sale, the forensic investigation, whatever comes next, make sure you subscribe because this is a live story and I'll make sure I follow it.